Okay, time for another edition of PennLive's Blue White Breakdown podcast. I'm Bob Flounders, joined by Greg Pickel. Going to talk some Lions in spring this week. Plenty of news coming out of spring practice, Greg, with some conference calls on players this week. Also, James Franklin and John Scott Jr., Penn State's defensive line coach. We heard from them. I heard from them midweek. They had some interesting comments as well. The weather's great, Greg. Even though there's not going to be a blue-white game a week from Saturday, we're taping this on a Thursday morning. Even though there's not going to be a blue-white game, there is going to be a practice. There's a chance that a couple of PennLive staffers will be up there. We're not going to mention any names, but it's always exciting to see, I think, Penn State. Last time you and I saw them was in late December, so that would be exciting just to see what's kind of going on, maybe get a little bit of a look at Mike Yurcich's coaching style. But Greg, how are you doing? What's going on with you? And what's maybe one or two things that jumped out from the player conference calls earlier this week? I know you were on a couple of them. What's going on with you, and what kind of jumped out to you this week?
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob, because it didn't feel like that we'd ever get to a point where spring practice was here. And now, as we talk about this on Thursday in the second week of April, it's almost over. So it's amazing how quickly time flew by. But yeah, listening to the players talk, I know there's a couple of younger guys we're going to get into here in a bit. And, they had Keaton Ellis, Jordan Stout, and a couple other guys available this week. And you got to take some of this with a grain of salt. I mean, we've heard some good things about a lot of players so far, and there's some that have stood out more than others. I think the Temple transfer Arnold Ebiketie is one guy who almost to a man, whether you talk to offensive linemen, defensive linemen, assistant coaches on either side of the ball, James Franklin, everyone raves about this kid. And it sounds to me like, if you read between the lines a couple weeks ago, James Franklin kind of said that Sean Clifford is sort of if you read between the lines, no one's really challenging him for the QB1 job. And I don't think anyone's challenging Ebiketie for the defensive end spot opposite Adisa Isaac. So, that's good news for him. I know you got a chance to listen to John Scott Jr. a little bit last night, and there were some other guys he pointed out. But, yeah, I mean, the defensive line obviously didn't have the production that it has had in years past last season. I don't think it's an automatic, time to blame John Scott. But it did have a lot of returners and didn't really do as much production-wise with as we would have expected. So, yeah, beyond that, though, things keep rolling along. It's been a good opportunity to hear from some different people and get some different perspectives. And to your point, hopefully everything goes off as planned next weekend and we'll get to see some things in action.
Yep. Greg, let's talk first about, you referenced it. Let's talk about Penn State's defensive line. I got a chance to listen to John Scott on Wednesday night, asked him about some players. Arnold Ebiketie, the transfer from Temple, his name is he's a popular guy to ask about. And Greg, that's because he was very productive at Temple last season as a redshirt junior. And Penn State fans, if you're smart, don't dismiss Temple defensive players. Temple has a pretty good recent track record of getting their best defensive players to play at a very high level, to play in the league. Penn State learned the hard way in 2015 that you dismiss Temple's defense at your own peril. Greg, this is a guy that you look at his body type and what he's listed at, about 6'3", 245. That's not a lot of weight on a defensive end, but Penn State's had a defensive end, Greg, that's played at around that size and played pretty successfully in Shaka Toney. I'm just wondering, Greg, and your thoughts on this. John Scott Jr. said he felt very fortunate to get both Arnold and Derek Tangelo as transfers into the Penn State program in a year when they definitely needed defensive line help with who left. And he said when it came to Arnold Ebiketie, there was some competition there from some pretty high-end schools that also wanted his services. I think he only played 6 games last year, Greg, something like 8.5 tackles for loss. I think he had 3 forced fumbles. It was really his first year as a starter. And Greg, my question is, do you think, he played at Temple. I think he was from Maryland. He wasn't a highly recruited kid, but, playing at Temple, maybe the presence of Deion Barnes, maybe on the Penn State staff as a defensive end, similarly sized, and maybe Shaka Toney. I just wonder who kind of influenced him maybe to come to Penn State. Obviously, he had a great opportunity. He didn't have to go far to maybe start somewhere. That could have influenced him as well. But how do you connect the dots when it comes to Penn State being able to secure the services? I think probably one of the better defensive ends in the transfer portal.
Yeah, I think the key here, Bob, was he was looking for a place that, had success in the past. And again, we'll note that Penn State had that success more so under Sean Spencer than they did in John Scott Jr. But I think there's still plenty, that they could sell there. But I think he also knew some players on this roster and some guys who have gone through the recruiting process with Penn State before. And I think that obviously played a pretty big role in all of this. And I think also one thing that we shouldn't forget is that Penn State was one of the first, I think, to reach out to him and really get in front of him and say, hey, look, we have this, that, and the other thing as opportunities to play right away and to make a big impact. And I have a hard time thinking that the depth chart wasn't appealing to him. And that's not trying to slight the guys who are still here, but how many times are you going to go somewhere as a transfer and walk into a place where they don't have any starters along their defensive line? And not only do they not have any starters, but they have very minimal returning depth that has proven anything so far. So, you're an all AAC pick. I understand it's a group of 5, but, that had to be pretty appealing to him based on everything that we knew he could do and where he could go. So, the chips just kind of fell Penn State's way for one transfer portal. It doesn't always work out that way. Tyke Smith, the former West Virginia safety, picking Georgia over the weekend is a good example of that, where Penn State maybe, it could have been a similar situation there. Obviously Brisker's back, but it's not like they have loads of safety production otherwise. But he had a position coach who went from West Virginia to Georgia, and that connection's going to be made again. So for Penn State, that's a tough loss. But with the defensive line, Bob, it was a pair of good wins.
Yeah. One thing to watch, this is a foreshadowing alert, Greg. You may not agree with me before we move on, but with Penn State and their defensive ends, James Franklin said when talking about Adisa Isaac and Arnold, he'd prefer them to be a little bit bigger going into the 2021 season. I think Adisa Isaac, best case scenario, he's going to probably struggle to play at 245, 250. He's another young player. Arnold, as I mentioned, is under 250 now. I think it's a priority, Greg, for them to get a little bit more weight and strength on them, because they open against a team that likes nothing more than to try to shove the ball right down your throat, simplify the game, force you to stop their running game. They have a big offensive line. They always have good quarterbacks. Wisconsin, I'm talking about on September 4th. I know it's only one game, Greg, but it's James Franklin and his players have talked about it. It's a tone setter after what happened last year when they started 0-5. James said a couple of weeks ago, we're going to find an awful lot out about our team early in the 2021 season, referencing the Wisconsin game on the road. And then a couple of weeks later, they host Auburn, which always has some good athletes on defense. Before I move on to Rasheed Walker, Greg, is that something that is, when James talks about that, usually when he brings something up, it's something that's probably stuck in his craw. Is that anything Penn State fans, should either be worried about or looking forward to and seeing if maybe those guys can get a little bigger?
Well, I think they have to. Penn State fans have to look forward to it, because if these guys don't
Right.
like you said, like James Franklin said, I think they're on the roster, both of them at like 241, 244, something like that. And
Yeah.
maybe they're a little bit bigger than what that roster says. Conversely, maybe they're a little bit smaller than what that roster says. So how much do they have to do? I know it seems like the season's a long time away, but guess what? You lose a lot of weight during summer camp when you're out there, getting after it in the heat and everything. So that's Penn State's biggest challenge. And again, the defensive line has to be better this year. The secondary has to be better this year, and they can help each other be better this year. But they've got a lot to prove at both of those spots. And I know that they have helped themselves with the two transfers up front, and we'll see if they can do anything in the back, Bob. But yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that those guys have to put weight on and have to be able to carry it throughout the course of this season. But let's keep in mind, this is not the first group of guys at defensive end who will struggle with that, because Shaka Toney did for a while too.
Yep. So the blue-white breakdown is moving on. I'm Bob Flounders with Greg Pickel. Let's talk. I want to talk about Rasheed Walker. Penn State's, he's now in his fourth year, but technically he's like still a redshirt sophomore because of the COVID 2020 year. This is a player that you and I are very high upon because of his physical talent, which is very obvious. Greg, I would say he almost has the ideal body to play left tackle at a high level, not only in college, but in the pros. 6'5", 325, the feet are quick. So much to like about him. He made PennLive's list of the 25 most interesting players and coaches this offseason for a reason. It was a pleasure doing that list with you, Greg. But the reason I want to bring him up, a couple of times now in the last week, the vibe I pick up from James Franklin is he views Rasheed Walker as a player with just such a high ceiling, and he can get so much better. But when you hear comments like James saying he's learned to become a better practice player, and he's starting to appreciate Penn State football all the more. I don't mean this in a negative, but I think James is trying to tell us that the light bulb has really started to go on with Rasheed Walker in terms of becoming maybe a more professional, if you will, college player, a more professional approach. This is what you can do, if you continue to develop, if you continue to practice at a high level. I think we've seen it before with some Penn State players. But do you think that maybe in a good way, James is kind of trying to send a message to Rasheed, and maybe Phil Troutwine's doing it as well? Like, look, we know what you can be. You just need to do X, Y, and Z. And now you're starting to do it. You're going to see the rewards.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, even listening to him talk on Tuesday of this week, you just got the sense that him and Phil Troutwine have a really good relationship, and he has totally bought into what Troutwine is teaching. And on one hand, I think you're right that he's probably done some maturing and growing up over the last year, as have a lot of members of this roster. I think the 0-5 start kind of forced that, but I don't think there's any doubt either that being able to be with Phil Troutwine and watch film. And I think James Franklin said that he's always over at Troutwine's house doing stuff. I mean, they've developed a pretty good bond, it seems like. And that obviously has everything, everything, if not a very large part, to do with the fact that he is able to be with him in person now, which wasn't the case last year. So if Rasheed Walker's taking that jump, you can only imagine what kind of leap these other guys up front are taking. Juice Scruggs, Mike Miranda, Caden Wallace, Des Holmes, the list goes on. But to me, that is very encouraging because, Rasheed Walker could have left, and he said it was a hard decision to come back.
Right.
Now, would he have went? I think it was probably a hard decision, but certainly the right one, because where he would have went versus where he could go after this year, I think are vastly different. It's like sitting front row at Beaver Stadium versus up where we are. But, I just think that with a big year here, he could be a first-round guy. There's no doubt about it. And I don't know if that's the case if he leaves after 2020. In fact, I'm almost certain it's not. So, the fact that he's made all these strides, if they actually transfer over to game day, He's going to make himself a lot of money this year. He's going to keep Sean Clifford much healthier this year, and he's going to anchor a Penn State line that I'm not even going to say it, but could be, I guess I will, could be better this year.
Penn State fans don't want to hear about the offensive line. We always, the last couple of years, we've been singing their praises. They started 0-5. Started 0-5 last year, gave up some sacks, and there were some issues in 2019. But you see flashes from a couple of these players that you see NFL ability. I don't think there's any question. Mike Miranda is an NFL player, not a tackle. Caden Wallace is a player to watch this year at the other tackle spot. Juice Scruggs' development coming off the back injury that was very significant a couple years ago. That's a great story. I think Penn State's got a lot of pieces that they like on the offensive line. I think Rasheed Walker as the left tackle at that size is probably their top player. But I do think there's some other players that are positioned to make a big move with a good spring on field with Phil Troutline. And I think we'll just have to wait and see what that offense looks like and what Mike Yurcich sees in that offensive line. I wonder if he's going to do some things that are quite different, Greg, that maybe Kirk Shiraka tried to do and could not because of spring. But let's just move along. Greg, the fan base always wants to know about the January enrollees or the first year or the red shirts. Who's looked good in spring and who is ready? You didn't really hear his name yet, but you're going to hear it this year. These two players are related, so this is actually even a neater story. But it's Kobe King and Kalen King. I want to make sure I got their names right. Kobe is the corner, Greg. Kalen is the linebacker.
Wrong.
It's the other way.
That's right.
Kalen is the corner. Kobe is the linebacker.
Yep.
And it's the corner that's really gotten more of the praise this spring. But now they're starting to talk about Kobe King as well. These are first-year players. Greg, it's not a surprise for a corner to play at Penn State in his first year, be it in a reserve role, in an extra DB set, or on special teams. But for a true freshman linebacker to draw some praise when Penn State returns all three starters and they're very high on second-year linebacker Curtis Jacobs, what do you think that means for Kobe King? They're both out of Michigan, the Detroit area. I think you like both of them as we talked about, the recruiting classes starting to come together. What can you tell us about those two? And when you hear James Franklin talk about them as guys that could help this year, who do you like better?
Yeah, I mean, they're one step away from being anointed 5 stars, and Kalen was a 4-star, Kobe was a 3-star. But I mean, every time we talk to somebody, those two come up, and I think that watching their tape, you got a sense that they could be pretty good at some point early in their career. I don't know if I anticipated this much discussion about them at this point in time. I mean, you're right. For a corner to get on the field early, it's easier. But at the same time, Penn State has a pretty deep corners room, especially with Tariq Castro-Fields back. So, I don't know how they see him fitting in there, if he's a nickel, if he's a corner, if he's just a rotation guy. But I mean, they are certainly going to use his 4 games up, I would think, if not more.
Yeah.
And then with Kobe King, Jesse Luketa, Ellis Brooks, obviously battling inside. We heard James Franklin say on Wednesday that if the season started to, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. If the season started today, that Brandon Smith and Curtis Jacobs would start at the outside linebacker spots, which I don't think that surprises anyone. But, inside, I think it could be more of a battle. And I'm not saying Kobe King's going to be ready immediately to jump in and do it, Bob. But, man, they both are making pretty big jumps at this point during not just the spring practice, but we heard these names from Dwight Galt after winter workouts too. So these guys wasted no time making an impression.
Yep. Curtis Jacobs, second year, one of the top players in the 2020 Penn State recruiting class.
21,
sorry. No, that's not right. 2021?
Yes.
Curtis Jacobs? Okay, anyway.
No, you're right.
I was going to say, I felt strongly I had this one right because he played in 2020.
That's all right. We're both -1 so far today. That's okay.
All right. Curtis Jacobs played sparingly in 2020. Didn't see the field a lot, but he was just a really touted player. By the time Penn State signed him to his 2020 in its 2020 class, a lot of people kind of thought he was a 5-star talent, not a 4-star talent. Theo Johnson was in that class. I know Penn State likes him. Curtis Jacobs is on the move this year. He's going to play the strong side position, the Sam position, linebacker. That was the spot that Brandon Smith started at last year. The difference is, even though it says strong side, that linebacker plays in space, Greg. It's kind of a weird designation. It plays to the field side, not the boundary side. Penn State fans were frustrated last year because Brandon Smith, the 5-star, was so far away from the ball. He was out in space away from the line of scrimmage. Well, that's the role that Curtis Jacobs, who's only 228 pounds, is going to work at this year. Brandon Smith is now going to go to the will spot. That was the spot Micah Parsons had a couple years ago where he became an All-American. The will spot is the boundary linebacker next to the middle linebacker. That's in the box, Greg. You're closer to the line of scrimmage. If you see a play, you can kind of get to the ball a little bit quicker. Greg, I think this is a great fit and a great move for Brandon Smith in his career. In his third year, he led Penn State in tackles for loss, playing in the outfield last year with 8. I just wonder why Penn State didn't make this move a little bit sooner. But, Greg, I think this bodes well for Penn State's linebacker group. They got their most talented, physically talented linebacker closer to the line of scrimmage. Do you agree?
I do, but I'm curious about this, Bob. True or false? Lance Dixon's departure had more or less to do with Curtis Jacobs' development. Does that tell us that in your mind that Curtis Jacobs was so far along that Lance Dixon kind of saw the train coming down the tracks, or do you think Dixon wanted the better situation somewhere else and maybe that has nothing to do with Curtis Jacobs' progression?
Yeah, I think it could be both, but I just remember, Greg, watching Lance Dixon when we saw him up close when we were at the Beaver Stadium games. He just looked so small. Even on TV, I really thought it was a safety trying to play in the box, at the line of scrimmage, and he guessed a lot, Greg. When he guessed right, he used his speed and he could make the play. But Greg, when he guessed wrong, that Penn State front seven got gashed. I think that I don't think there's any question that they like Curtis Jacobs, but I think Lance Dixon just wasn't the way that Penn State uses their linebackers and where they were using him. I don't know that it was a great fit. I think he did see the writing on the wall, but to me, he just looked like he was a little too small. I think he is at West Virginia now, and they'll use him a little bit more as a hybrid player, or is he at Michigan? I can't remember where it is.
West Virginia.
I think he's more of a hybrid player than a pure linebacker, but there's no question when James Franklin said, when Curtis Jacobs would probably start if the season was going to start today. I just immediately, I know I shouldn't laugh about this, but I'm sure Ellis Brooks and Jesse Luketa are like, what? Wait, there's 4 of us. We started last year, but I think that Penn State knows, Greg, they need to get more speed on the field. I think Jesse and Ellis Brooks can have a defined role as linebackers. But you want in this game, if they're going to spread you out or you got to be quick to react, I think it makes a lot of sense to have Curtis and Brandon Smith on the field. I just don't know who's going to be the odd man out between Luketa and Ellis Brooks.
Yeah, I don't either, but it should be an interesting battle to see. And again, I think I don't think we can count out Kobe King from that battle either.
Okay.
It's obviously a really difficult thing for a freshman to come in and play that middle linebacker role and kind of move the defense and everything else. And it would be rather crazy if Kobe King got that opportunity and Micah Parsons did not as a freshman. But, we've heard enough about the King twins to think that, either we're being fed a line of, they're either being overinflated or these two really did come in with the kind of work ethic, drive, and ability to have put themselves in these conversations. And I think it's the latter. I think they have.
Yeah, and Penn State, since just as James's 8th season, almost, every time he's mentioned a young player in spring, he's not just blowing smoke, especially a scholarship player. If you hear the players or a prominent assistant or James talk about this player repeatedly, if he stays healthy, he's gonna have a role on the team in the fall, even if it's special teams and second team. They almost never talk up a player if they don't really like him. I think that bodes well for the Kings. So let me try this again. Kalen King is the corner. Kobe King is the linebacker, right?
Nailed it, Bob.
All right. Before we wrap up this edition of the Blue White Breakdown, I just want to throw this out there. Harrisburg High's Micah Parsons has gotten an invite to the NFL draft. Not a big shocker, Greg. The draft is going to be in Cleveland at the end of this month. I think it starts on a Thursday, maybe the last Thursday in April, if I'm not mistaken. I know you and I are looking forward to seeing this draft with the Penn State players. On a personal note, though, Greg, my only question is, I think media seating is going to be a challenge at the draft. Had we had the chance to go to Cleveland, you and I, and go to the Flats, see the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, maybe take in an Indians game, how much trouble do you think we could have gotten into if we had a chance to drive out to Cleveland and spend a couple days at the draft? Be honest.
Yeah, I would say quite a bit, Bob. Quite a bit. So maybe
no details, just quite a bit.
Right. Maybe the pandemic helped us out there. But yeah, so he'll be out there. I think they said it like a list of, 10 or so guys. There'll be 10 or 15 more, I'm sure. They're going to try and do as much of it in person as possible. So
right.
Yeah, at this point, obviously, Micah is the mock drafts are crazy. I mean, They have him just about every team in the top 25 could possibly draft him or have the chance to anyway. So we'll see. It could be smoke screens. It could be something else. But, here's a guy who, just looks fantastic, looks like he's ready for the pros, and we'll see how things shake out in 2 weeks time. It's not far away, that's for sure.
I can't wait. The weather's great. There's a Penn State practice coming up that hopefully some media members will be able to attend so we can share some more thoughts, but that's not for another couple of Saturdays. We will be back with the Blue White Breakdown next week. Greg and I, probably Dave Jones will make an appearance next week as well. It's literally a daily Blue White podcast, especially in season. You'll hear from Dustin Hawkinsmith at times also. We've been doing it for a while. We enjoyed doing it, Greg. People can go where to rate us, review us, watch us, listen to us, see more of Lola the Golden Retriever. What's the best avenue to consume the Blue White Breakdown podcast?
You know it, Bob. The Blue White Breakdown podcast is available wherever you get your audio. So Spotify, Stitcher, Google, Apple, anywhere you find podcasts, you'll find us and the videos, youtube.com/allpennstate.